2. Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, a book that was on my reading list for this month. It is about homeless people and ghost ? I am referring to Tokyo Ueno Station by Miri Yu. For those who don't know, Miri Yu is a Korean-Japanese author. I believe she is specifically Zainichi, which is the ethnic term for Korean-Japanese individuals, which I didn't know about, which is a fun fact in case you didn't know about it either. She has written quite a bit in terms of short stories and in terms of regular books. And she has received death threats for her writing, possibly because she is somewhat critical of the Japanese government and of injustice in general that would earn anybody a death threat. She published this book in 2019, and I believe she won an award for it, as well as another award for one of her other books that she's read. This book is quite interesting and explores poverty and how we treat people who are poor a little bit. It's unusual writing, but I'll go into that a little bit more depth in the analysis. So for now, let's just talk about the summary, and then I'll do an analysis, and then we'll move on from there. So Tokyo Ueno Station focuses on Kazu. At least I think it focuses on Kazu. The main character, I don't think we ever see their name ever in the story. It's in the book jacket and also in the one of the summaries I found online, because I was a bit confused about what was happening in the story at one point. And I don't think the character is ever named, but that's what the jacket calls the main character, Kazu. They are a homeless man in modern Japan, and basically the story goes about them remembering their life. I think they might say that they're a ghost, but they could be talking in metaphors about how the homeless are ghosts, but the summary description I found indicates that Kazu might literally be a ghost, and this might be him remembering his life after he has died. It's a bit unclear there. But in his remembrance of his own life, he talks about how he was born into poverty. His parents had to work for everything that they had, and he had to help out with the family too, getting some jobs here and there as he was growing up. And this poverty continued while he was married too, as he didn't really have the means to, help his wife along, so she had to pick up a job too. And he remembers feeling a bit sad when his child was born because he didn't have any money to pay for the midwife that came along. So a little bit of a shame going on there. The narrator talks about his son, Koichi, who shares some names with the crown prince who was born on the exact same day, feeling a bit of pride there. But later on, when Koichi is 21, he ends up dying for some unspecified reasons, natural causes or whatever. But to die naturally at 21 is a bit unusual. The narrator also talks about their friendship with an individual named Shige, who was also at one point homeless, and Kazu kind of turns away Shige because of the feeling that if you get too attached to anyone, something bad is going to happen, because his son dies, and things don't really seem to be going well for Kazu throughout his entire life. He does at one point go to a hostess club in Japan, and he meets a woman named Junko, and he ends up getting somewhat attached to her. Maybe it's because she won't be there like when he goes home afterwards, but he ends up developing somewhat of a friendship with her before he ultimately never sees her again. And then about 7 years after his son dies, his wife also dies, which throws him into somewhat of a depression and leaves him with no one really. His daughter has long since moved out. His granddaughter occasionally comes by for a visit in order to basically make sure that he's doing well in his old age. But he decides that he doesn't want his granddaughter taking care of an old man for the rest of his life. He wants her to do something else. And so he decides to leave for Tokyo and tells his family not to look for him. And so that's how the narrator found themselves, Kazu found himself at Tokyo Ueno Station. One day the park is cleared out by the police because the emperor is coming by for a visit, and the emperor doesn't want to be seeing any homeless people, or rather the powers that be don't want the emperor to see any homeless people. Especially because at the time that this story is being told, around 2012, Tokyo is trying to win a bid for the 2020 Olympics, which they eventually do, and so they have to do regular evictions in the various parks in Tokyo in order to make it seem like there isn't a homeless problem, even though there clearly is. The emperor only visits for a small bit, just driving straight on by, and the narrator feels intense anger and frustration because he realizes there's some parallels to the emperor's life and his life, and how his son was born around the time the emperor's son was born, and if like he had been any luckier, that might have been his life, or he might have had a comparably good life instead of the unlucky life that he had. So that's just the remainder of his life there. Eventually he decides that he wants to visit family, so he heads to the train station, and right there he begins to see a vision of Mari dying in the Fukushima tsunami disaster, and that fills him with sadness. And from there the story ends with him hearing the upcoming train. So I guess it's left up for him, or for the reader, to decide if he gets on that train or if he stays in his current position. But there's another implication here that I was reading in the summary that someone else got from this, that he actually jumped in front of the train. And this is him sort of reliving his entire life as a ghost. I don't really see a lot to indicate that he did jump in front of the train, but that's something that's there. Miri Yu's writing can be sometimes vague at times, so you could very well argue for something like that. In terms of analysis, this book is sad. That is the end of my analysis. And I'm just kidding there. This book is indeed very sad, to the point where I do wonder sometimes what Miri Yu's point is. Like, I get what point she's trying to make, but sometimes this book seems sad for sadness' sake, and it doesn't seem like Miri Yu is really reaching for a point, even though she clearly is. Her writing makes it very hard to latch onto anything at times, which is unfortunately how it goes sometimes. And it's a double-edged sword. Like her writing is hard to understand, but it's also very beautiful writing. So I'm left with many strange thoughts about the very nature of this book. But one thing that's very clear about this book is that Miri Yu is trying to say some things about poverty, and specifically how society views those people in poverty, particularly Japanese society at the time that this story was being written. So it's clear that Kazu has struggled for years to get by. In his childhood, he watched as his parents tried to make ends meet, and things not going so well for them. And even as he grew to an adult, Kazu worked harder and harder. He even noted that he worked massive amounts of overtime. Even after his kids were born, he would go off for weeks and not see them in order to get some money and then send it home to his family. So a lot of overtime, meaning that he didn't see his family as much, and he didn't really have much of a loving relationship with his wife. Not because he didn't care about her, but because he cared so much about her that he wanted her to be able to thrive, which is easy to understand. Like, he wanted his son to have what he wanted, not go without some of the fun things in life. But unfortunately, because he was poor, and he like, poverty is a cycle that just grows deeper and deeper. He wasn't ever able, no matter how hard he worked, to get his children what they needed to survive. And so, again, poverty leads to fewer and fewer opportunities because so often in society, people view those who are in poverty as deserving of that. Like, why did you get yourself here? What did you do to earn this poverty? Rather than recognizing poverty as something that happens, unfortunately, and sometimes we can't dig ourselves out of it. It's very sad in this book to see Kazu go through something like that, and see his family go through something like that, and see how generationally things aren't getting much better. And although his son and his daughter may have been doing somewhat better, his son committed suicide, and I imagine that all the money that Kazu's daughter was sending him wasn't helping her to get out of any cycle of poverty that she was in. And there's a lot of internal feelings about all this poverty too. It's not working out for Kazu, and you can see that it probably wasn't bearing well for Kazu's children, because I think that although it's not explicitly said that Kazu's son committed suicide, Koichi might have turned to drugs or turned to something else because of this cycle of poverty that he was stuck in. There's a good quote that I would like to read you that really gets at the feelings of shame. 10 days before Koichi was born, some officials from the tax office trampled through our house, attaching red slips of paper to almost everything. They didn't touch the rice cooker or table, of course, but they marked the chest of drawers, the radio, and the clock. You're doing us a favor, taking all this old shit anyway, my father spat, drunk on cheap hooch. I felt pathetic, waking up and eating meals in a house full of repossession notices. And you can see the shame that Kazu feels. But you can also see what it's done to his father. His father might have, turned to alcoholism, or is just drinking away his pain, rather than acknowledge that the family is losing so much on a constant basis because they're trapped in this cycle of poverty and debt. And it really seems like society is uncaring. I believe that Miri Yu is really good at highlighting this. The regular evictions that take place in the park for the homeless, and the way that society sees the homeless, or doesn't see them, but views them as invisible, like having in private conversations around the homeless, because who are they going to tell? No one cares for them, so you can say whatever you want. They're not actual functioning members of society, according to these people. I think the clearest example of how uncaring it is, though, is all the talk of the Olympics during this story. Miri Yu does a really good job of bringing this up twice. Once in the 1960s, and again as Japan tries to win a bid for the 2020 Olympics. But there's comparisons of those two periods of time where both Kazu and his father worked really hard to make ends meet, and even worked around the Olympics in order to really provide a means for their family to live. But one has to wonder, why would Japan work so hard to bring the Olympics to Tokyo if they haven't even addressed the homeless problem that exists in the country? If you can afford if you can afford these lavish stadiums and this new technology for security and privacy and all of this stuff, then surely you could afford to house the homeless, right? That seems to be something that I think Miri Yu is getting at, like the haves and the have-nots, and how countries spend so much on unnecessary things, even though they could very well spend that same money to help the less well off in their cultures. That's something I've been thinking about for 2024, as Los Angeles host what I think might be the Summer Olympics or something like that. But Los Angeles has a big homeless problem as much as like so many other issues. And for them to spend so much money on bringing the Olympics to LA, especially given that the Olympics are very costly and often result in host cities losing a lot of money in the effort. It seems like a bad choice when you could funnel that money into other areas that would serve the community even more. And that's something that Miri Yu's writing has gotten me to think about. So she's done a wonderful job there. And I also like the comparison between the emperor and the prince. How the emperor is just driving through the park, and the entire park is being evicted for the emperor. So again, why does the society have an emperor, especially one who doesn't care about the homeless problem? It reminds me of like England's issue with the queen. Like, why do they still have a queen? Isn't that a bit bourgeoisie in a society that hasn't really looked after its members of the lower classes? So a lot to think about in that comparison between the emperor and the prince. And so I think Miri Yu does a really good job in that regard. The only issue is there's an unusual use of time and space where it's difficult to know, what's actually happening in this story, because she's constantly flipping between the past, the present, and also focusing on other characters, especially just the random passerbys. And it really, like, when someone argues that, that this character could be a ghost, that seems believable. But it's really hard to identify that in Miri Yu's writing because it seems vague. Like, it's beautiful writing. Like, I felt really moved while reading this. But at the same time, I struggled to really understand what Miri Yu was trying to say, because her writing was kind of flowy. Like, it flowed, but it didn't flow between tangible points. I didn't even really understand the vision that Kazu had of his granddaughter Mari dying in the Fukushima disaster. Was that a prophecy sort of vision, or was that just like him seeing his granddaughter dying in a disaster because of his own experiences in life? I don't really know. Maybe that's something that Miri Yu wants you to think about, but it's hard to really tell because of how vague her writing is. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Tokyo Ueno Station by Miri Yu. I thought it was an interesting story, but I'm going to say I ended up giving it like 3 stars on Goodreads. Like, I rated it lower. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's bad. It just means I didn't understand it personally. I didn't really get what Miri Yu was going for beyond the whole poverty thing. And maybe that's all she was going for, in which case, great job. But it feels like she's trying to say some other things too that I just don't understand. And I'm not afraid to say I don't understand that, and that's why I rated it lower. I don't necessarily think it's bad. It's not for me. I'm definitely going to recommend this to you because whoever's listening out there watching this might get more value out of this book than I did. This was recommended to me by my friend Bevan, so she certainly enjoyed it more than I did. So yeah, definitely check it out if this sounds like something that might interest you. Otherwise, again, if you read this before or you want to comment on something I said here, feel free to comment below. Let's have a discussion about this interesting book. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Miri Yu, a pretty interesting writer. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and potentially ghostly travels. Farewell.